The Apex listener, it's written in Java, so of course you have to have Java installed on whatever server you want to run it on. It's shipped as a web archive, apex.war. It is an absolutely normal web archive. I've installed it, we can see it. Apex.war, there it is. It's just a web archive file conforming to the absolutely normal standards. You need to have Java installed. I've already done that, so Java, normal problems with Java, my Java. I'm using the Linux alternate system. If you do set up the Apex listener, you'll have to make sure you have a supported release of Java installed. The Java I'm using is, I'm using Hotspot 1.7 point whatever. Whether you choose to use Java Hotspot or whether you choose to use JRocket, I don't believe there's a significant difference in the two releases. The two JVMs will almost certainly be merged in the very near future anyway. I just use Java Hotspot because that's what happens to be shipped with the Linux that I'm working on. Under Linux, you'll need to configure your Java through the alternative system, so you can support multiple versions. Under Windows, well, if you have an expert Windows administrator, you can also maintain multiple releases of Java. I would generally try to use only one release on the machine anywhere. Then, having got Java installed, you need something within which to run your Java. Right. That means you need to deploy the web archive, which is the Apex listener, to a Java container. Glassfish container, a WebLogic container, or theoretically even a third-party container. Now, I've heard of people using Tomcat, for instance. I can't imagine why anyone would, but a third-party container is theoretically usable. Glassfish or WebLogic? Why would you make the difference? Well, WebLogic you have to pay for. Glassfish you don't. And that's an important point for licensing. You can install Glassfish on any machine in the environment, which means you can separate out your web listening tier, where the web listener will be running, from the database tier, where your Apex application will be running. Now, to set it up is a bit of a mission. I did want to demonstrate the whole installation of Glassfish in a webinar, but there really wasn't going to be time. So I have already installed Glassfish. The Glassfish wizard install, it's a wizard-driven install. It's not too bad, though you may come across a few anomalies. So my Glassfish is already running. There's a standard port you use for administration purposes, and it is all okay. So to connect to that port, check, I'll need to log on again. I'm running on the local host, by the way, to avoid some security issues. Okay, let's just move on. I've configured my Glassfish listener, and I've set up listening addresses. So your listening addresses you configure within the Glassfish environment, Glassfish being the container. So Glassfish itself is listening for HTTP. And I've given it 3 addresses. I've got my admin service, with which I'm in communication right now on 4848, and I've configured 8080 and 8181. 8080 I'm going to use for Apex over HTTP, 8181 for Apex over secure sockets. So you configure your web listening endpoints within the Glassfish environment. Now, then we have to deploy the software. So looking at the applications link, very simple to do, it's very easy to do. Within Glassfish, the wizard is quite handy. I deploy 2 applications, Apex and one called I. The Apex application, that's the apex.war file, the apex.war, and generally speaking, click the deploy and navigate to wherever your Apex war file happens to be. Just browse to it and find it. And having found it, create a virtual path. So we create the virtual path when we deploy the war file. The path I've created in this case, Apex. It's my virtual path. So we define the virtual path at the point when you deploy the apex.war file, then extend the virtual path later on when we create the Apex applications themselves. We deploy another application, the I application, and that is just the pointer towards the images that are used by your Apex programmers. So deploying through the wizard, very straightforward. Now, final stage I need to create a path to an application. Now the Apex War file there it is, has a reasonable user interface. If I Java it, so if I Java -jar apex.war, it even comes with a bit of help. I can just give it the help command. So that's my code for the Apex listener, which I've already deployed through Glassfish. What do? You can map URLs, you can set up a database connection. Well, the Apex listener running in Glassfish needs to know where to send, where the database actually is. So for that I use the setup command. So Apex War, just Java -jar Apex War setup. And I'll set up a database connection, which is just an arbitrary name. I'll call it Apex Demo. And the little user interface will give me a prompt. Name of the database server, localhost, well, 192.168.56.101. And this could be any machine anywhere on the planet, firewalls permitting, because remember you'd normally be separating the location of the Apex listener from the location of the database. What ports do we get to that database on? Default port 1521. Name the service or SID. I'll choose a SID and give it the service ORCL. Database public user, Apex public user, default is Apex public user, and the password. Right, RESTful services, I'm not too bothered about them, so I shall skip that step. And that's configured it. So I've now created Apex Demo as a database connection string. That's just a logical name that tells the Apex listener, go to that machine, that port, connect to a database instance called that, logged on to that user. Then I extend the virtual path for one particular application, Java -jar. Again, the jar file Apex War, and the command map URL. Remember that command there? Map URL. Map a URL pattern to a named database connection. Because my one Apex listener might be routing connections through to 20 different databases on 20 different machines. So map URL, and the URL I'm going to map will be /demo to Apex Demo. So I'm associating that virtual path with that database connector, and that database connector is associated with a database on that machine, that port of that name, and that logon. So associate a URL with the database connect string. And at that point, I can theoretically hand it over to the Apex guys. I'll better see if it actually functions. So the port, the virtual path I created, and then F, the famous F function, and the page. So that is going through the Apex listener. Local host, I think I was having trouble, it was security issues, I was having trouble coming through an IP address. Okay, localhost is now functioning. So, and at this point, I can log on, and having got that far, provided I get my credentials correct, and at last I'm through. And now it's over to the developers for the normal creation of an instance and defining the Apex application.